Hey everyone, it's Matt again, and today we're going to show you how to rebuild this push-on Chrysler cable. So like always, what we're going to do to get started is make sure we have all of our components. We have our nut and ferrule assembly for our bottom end, and on the top end here we have our push-on Chrysler cable and our little crush ring, which I will show you how that works in a minute here, but what it does is it goes onto this ferrule and you crush it onto the casing. Lastly, we have a little brass collar here. Now the brass collar is meant to go on this side of the cable so that the cable hangs on this side and doesn't just flow right out of the cable. So we will get the casing cut and go from there. Make sure to clean and deburr the casing. We'll get our bottom end completed first, nut on the right way. Slide on our ferrule. You only want it going down right at about the base. Right about the base like that. That's about as far as you want to go. Take your pliers. Slipped out. And there you have it. So this other side's a little more complicated. What you have to do is make sure this ring and this all crush together to make it nice and tight. So what we'll do first is slide on our ring, push on our ferrule. This has a stop internally, so you can't push it in too deep, so get it nice and snug there. Pull up our crush ring, and like you see, this floats around. And what we're going to do is crimp that down with our pliers so this doesn't go anywhere. Make sure it's all lined up. Now what you want to do here is use the bigger setting because you're crimping over a much larger ferrule. So that's why we use the bigger size on these pliers. Get everything in position, crimp it down. And just like that. So now that we have our inner core cut, what we need to do is actually swedge down each end to a 104 square. And how we do that is a two-stage swedge process. The first one is to put in the rough shape, but it's not as fine of a 104 square. And the second one is a finishing die to make sure it's nice and smooth and very hard corners. And then that way you won't have any trouble sliding it in and out of anything you need. So let's get this swedged down and then get our collar put on. So here we have our two dies. Our green one here is our rough die to get the nice rough shape into it. And our red die here to hammer in a much finer shape into it so it gets all the corners nice and hard and straight. And then that way we have no problems with our gauge or our transmission. It's a very loud process, and I apologize ahead of time if the camera shakes around a bit. Even though this is a concrete floor and the camera's on a stand here, it's probably going to jiggle around a lot, so I apologize ahead of time, but let's get this started. So as you can see, this just gives a nice rough shape into it. Now let's just put this in our finishing die and get it nice and more uniform, and the corners much more pronounced. So as you can kind of see here on camera, the edges are much more pronounced and there's a much sharper edge on that. So what we'll do is get our collar put on, grease it, and then this cable is good to go. So now that we have our inner core completed, what we need to do now is get on our little brass collar. I've actually determined where we need to put it, and it's about right here. Now I always make sure the cable inner core is cut longer than I need, and I square it longer than it needs to, just so I have some extra room to work with in case I measured wrong or something needs to be altered, so that way I have that little bit of wiggle room and you don't have to actually throw out all of your work. So let's get this crimped on and test fit it into the housing and trim it up, and then we should be ready for grease. Now what you want to make sure you do is put on the collar correctly. You want to have the big flared out part on the bottom, not on the tip end, so that way it sits flush against the casing or a ferrule or whatever have you that this will hang against. So we'll crimp that on and then we'll test fit it. Crimp that on, and just like so. So as an example here, I have the old cable here. As you can see, you don't need a lot of cable to actually go into the gauge. So we just need to trim up a little bit so that's actually about the same size, because if you put it in, or sorry, make it too long, what you end up doing is pushing too much against this casing here, and what'll happen is things can bind internally and wobble around more than they should, and what you can have is cables breaking. So let's get that trimmed up and then we should be good to go. So right about there, we'll clip it off, and we'll use that extra length there to use the grinder to put a little pointed tip on there, and then we should be good to go. And now we got a nice little tip on there, so it's much easier to slide into the gauge when you're pushing on the cable. I've already made sure the bottom end works the same, and let's get this greased up, and then this cable is ready to go. Get everything nice and greased. Make sure you cover every little bit of the inner core. Now sometimes what will happen when you finally bottom the cable out, you'll find a lot of excess kind of inside the ferrule. And depending on what it's being used for, that's totally fine. But in this case, we don't want too much going into the gauge. So we're just gonna take our little pick here and clean it all out, and then it should be good. And that's how you make a push-on Chrysler cable. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the comments section below. As always, like and subscribe, and to the next time, have a good one.